July 5, 1943. The sun rises over the rolling fields of central Russia, near the city of Kursk. In the pre-dawn darkness, over 6,000 tanks and assault guns begin their engines. Nearly 2 million soldiers prepare for battle. The fate of the Second World War hangs in the balance. This is the story of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. A clash of titans that would determine whether Nazi Germany could still win the war in the East, or whether the Soviet Union would begin its unstoppable march toward Berlin. For 50 days, across a front stretching over 500 kilometers, two ideologies, two military machines, and two ways of life would collide in a storm of steel and fire that would leave the earth scorched and hundreds of thousands dead. To understand Kursk, we must first understand the desperate position Germany found itself in by mid-1943. Just 6 months earlier, the German Sixth Army had surrendered at Stalingrad, the first major defeat of Hitler's seemingly invincible wehrmacht. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The winter of 1942–43 had been catastrophic for Germany. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces had pushed westward, recapturing Kharkov and threatening to collapse the entire southern wing of the German front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's brilliant counteroffensive in March 1943 had stabilized the line and even recaptured Kharkov, but it had also created something unexpected, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines centered on the city of Kursk. This bulge, or salient as military strategists call it, extended westward into German-held territory like a giant fist. It was 250 kilometers wide at its base and pushed 150 kilometers into German lines. To Hitler and his generals, it represented both a danger and an opportunity. Field Marshal von Manstein saw the tactical opportunity immediately. By attacking from both north and south, German forces could cut off the salient at its base, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in a modern cannon, repeating Hannibal's legendary double envelopment. It would be a devastating blow that might knock the Soviet Union out of the war. But there was a problem. The Soviets knew exactly what the Germans were planning. Soviet intelligence was at its peak in 1943. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, the British ultra-codebreakers, and Soviet agents throughout occupied Europe all fed information to Moscow. Stalin and his generals knew about Operation Citadel, the German codename for the Kursk offensive, almost as soon as Hitler approved it. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the brilliant defender of Moscow and Stalingrad, proposed a radical strategy: let the Germans attack. Build defences so deep and so strong that the Wehrmacht would break itself trying new to penetrate them. Then, when the Germans were exhausted, launch a massive counter-offensive that would destroy them completely. What followed was perhaps the most extensive defensive preparation in military history. From April to July 1943, the Soviets transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress. Not just one line of defense, but 8 successive defensive belts, stretching back over 250 kilometers. Soviet civilians and soldiers worked day and night. They dug 10,000 kilometers of trenches, enough to stretch from Moscow to New York. They laid 400,000 mines. They built 20,000 artillery positions. Every village became a fortress. Every hill became a strong point. The defensive belts were layered like a deadly wedding cake. The first belt would slow the German advance and identify their main thrust. The second and third would bleed them white. The fourth through eighth would be there if somehow the impossible happened and the Germans broke through. The Soviets concentrated over 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars. That's more guns than the entire British Army possessed. The density of artillery was unprecedented. 1 gun for every 15 metres of front line in the most critical sectors. And the tanks. The Soviets assembled over 5,000 tanks and assault guns within the Kursk salient, with thousands more in reserve. The workhorse was the legendary T-34, which combined speed, armour and firepower in a done-to-design German generals called the finest tank in the world. But the Soviets didn't just wait passively. They trained their troops in anti-tank tactics. Tank killer teams learned to work with artillery and infantry. Entire armies rehearsed defensive scenarios over and over again. Behind German lines, partisan units, numbering over 100,000 fighters, prepared to strike. They would cut rail lines, blow up bridges, and attack supply columns. The Germans would be strangled from behind, even as they attacked from the front. The Germans weren't idle either. Hitler became obsessed with Citadel. He delayed the offensive again and again, waiting for new weapons that he believed would guarantee victory. The most feared was the Tiger tank, a 56-ton monster with armour up to 100 mm thick, and the legendary 88 mm gun that could destroy any Soviet tank from over 2 kilometres away. Even more advanced was the Panther, Germany's answer to the T-34. Fast, well-armoured with a superb 75 mm high-velocity gun, the Panther was perhaps the best all-around tank of the war. Hitler wanted hundreds of them for Kursk. The Germans also deployed the Ferdinand, a massive tank destroyer with armour up to 200 mm thick. Nearly impervious to Soviet anti-tank guns, it mounted the long-barreled 88 mm that could kill at incredible ranges. In the air, the Luftwaffe concentrated over 2,000 aircraft, including the famous Stuka dive bombers and the new Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters. It was the largest concentration of German air power since the Battle of Britain. But even as preparations continued, doubts grew. Every week of delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. Some generals, including the brilliant tank commander Heinz Guderian, argued that Citadel should be cancelled. The element of surprise was gone. The Soviets were clearly expecting them. Hitler wavered but ultimately decided to proceed. He believed the new weapons would be decisive. He also felt Germany needed a victory to restore morale and convince wavering allies like Romania and Hungary to stay in the war. By late June, nearly 800,000 German soldiers, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 10,000 artillery pieces were in position. The northern pincer, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, would attack from the Orel area. The southern pincer, under Field Marshal von Manstein, would strike from the Belgorod sector. The plan was to meet near the city of Kursk itself, trapping the Soviet forces inside. The stage was set for the greatest clash of armour in history, July 4th, 1943, the night before the attack. On both sides, men checked their weapons, wrote letters home, and tried to sleep. Many wouldn't see another sunrise. The Germans were confident. They had the best tanks, the most experienced troops, and a plan that had worked before at Kiev, at Vyazma, at Bryansk. The panzer commanders remembered the great encirclements of 1941, when hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had been surrounded and captured. But the Soviets were ready. In their deep trenches and bunkers they waited with a grim determination. They remembered 1941 too, the disasters, the retreats, the millions of prisoners. But that was the past. This time would be different. At 2 a.m. on July 5th, Soviet artillery opened fire in a massive preemptive bombardment. They had learned the exact time of the German attack through intelligence. Hundreds of guns erupted, targeting German assembly areas. It was meant to disrupt and delay. It worked, partially. The German offensive was delayed by several hours, and some units took casualties. But the Wehrmacht had dispersed enough that the damage was limited. The offensive would go ahead. 5:30 a.m. July 5th. The northern attack begins. Field Marshal Model's 9th Army, spearheaded by XL 7 Panzer Corps, rolls forward. The ground shakes with the rumble of hundreds of tanks. But immediately the advance bogs down. The Soviet defences are far stronger than expected. Minefields channel the panzers into killing zones. Hidden anti-tank guns open fire at close range. The Germans advance, but slowly, too slowly. The Ferdinand tank destroyers prove a disappointment. Their thick armour makes them nearly invulnerable to frontal attack, but they lack machine guns. Soviet infantry teams infiltrate close and attack with grenades and Molotov cocktails. Dozens of Ferdinands are disabled or destroyed. The fighting is savage. Villages change hands multiple times. The Germans advance yard by bloody yard through the defensive belts. Soviet troops fight with a desperation born of knowledge. They know that behind them lie their homes, their families. In the air, the largest air battles of the war rage. Up to 300 aircraft at a time swirl in massive dogfights. The Luftwaffe initially has the advantage with their experienced pilots and superior FW-190 fighters. But the Soviets have numbers. For every German plane, there are 2 or 3 Soviet aircraft. By July 7th, after 3 days of intense fighting, Model's forces have advanced only 12 kilometers. They've taken horrific casualties. The Soviets have fed in reserves, and the defensive lines hold. Model's attack is effectively halted. The southern attack, however, is a different story. Von Manstein's Army Group South is stronger, with more tanks and better commanders. The legendary Fünfzehn SS Panzer Corps, 3 elite divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf, forms the spearhead. These are Hitler's best. Veterans of the Eastern Front, equipped with the newest tanks, they're the most powerful armoured force Germany has ever assembled. Their commander, SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, is one of Germany's finest tactical commanders. The SS Panzers punch through the first Soviet defensive belt with relative ease. They're heading for the small town of Prokhorovka, a railroad junction that's the key to breaking into the open country beyond. If they can break through here, the way to Kursk itself would be open. The fighting is ferocious. German tactical superiority shows. Their tanks work in coordination with infantry and engineers. They bypass strong points, encircle them, reduce them methodically. The Soviets lose thousands of men, but they buy time with their lives. Soviet counterattacks are hurled at the German spearheads. Tank brigades charge forward, often with minimal reconnaissance, straight into German guns. The Tigers and Panthers destroy them at range. In some sectors, the battlefield becomes a graveyard of Soviet armour. But the Soviets have tanks to spare. For every 10 destroyed, another 10 appear. The Germans are winning tactically, but bleeding operationally. They're losing tanks they can't replace, veteran crews that take years to train. By July 11th, Manstein's forces have penetrated nearly 35 kilometers, much farther than Model in the north. They're approaching Prokhorovka. One more push might break through. Soviet High Command makes a critical decision. Commit the strategic reserve. July 12, 1943, the small town of Prokhorovka. What happens here over the next 12 hours will become legend, the single largest tank engagement in history. The Soviets have rushed the 5th Guards Tank Army to the sector. Over 800 tanks and self-propelled guns under the command of Pavel Rotmistrov. Their mission: stop the SS Panzer Corps at any cost. Rotmistrov faced a dilemma. German tanks, especially Tigers and Panthers, had superior guns and armour. In a long-range duel, Soviet T-34s would be massacred. So he chose the only option: charge. Get so close that Soviet 76 mm guns could penetrate German armour, turn the battle into a melee where German technological superiority would matter less. At dawn, over 600 Soviet tanks burst from the morning mist in waves, charging straight at the German lines. The SS Panzer crews couldn't believe their eyes. The entire horizon was covered with tanks. The Germans opened fire at maximum range. Tigers destroyed T-34s at 2,000 metres. Panthers killed at 1,500 metres. Soviet tanks exploded, burned, disintegrated. But they kept coming, closing the range, accepting horrific losses to get close enough to fight back. Within minutes, the battle dissolved into chaos. Tanks fighting at ranges of 100 metres or less. T-34s ramming German tanks. Hand-to-hand combat between tank crews. The roar of engines, the crash of guns, the screams of burning men created a hell beyond imagination. The battlefield became so choked with destroyed tanks that movement was almost impossible. Tanks tried to maneuver around burning hulks of their comrades. Commanders lost all control. This was pure, savage combat. By afternoon, both sides were exhausted. The Soviets had lost over 300 tanks destroyed or damaged, catastrophic casualties. But the SS Panzer Corps had been stopped. They had lost perhaps 80, 100 tanks, but more critically, their offensive momentum was shattered. The myth of Prokhorovka, 800 tanks on each side, 1,600 tanks total, grew in the decades after. The reality was perhaps 1,200 tanks total, and the Germans actually held the field, but strategically the Soviets had won. The German advance was halted. They would never break through. July 13, 1943. Hitler summoned his senior commanders to his headquarters. The news from Kursk was mixed. Model's attack in the north had failed completely. Manstein's attack in the south had advanced significantly but at massive cost and was now stalled. But that wasn't why Hitler called the meeting. The day before, July 12th, the same day as Prokhorovka, the Western Allies had invaded Sicily. Italy was about to collapse. German forces would be needed in the Mediterranean and in Italy itself. Moreover, the Soviets had launched their own offensives against the German salients at Orel and Meuse. They were attacking the attackers, threatening to encircle German forces that had been stripped of reserves for Citadel. Hitler made the decision. Citadel was over. The offensive was cancelled. Forces would be withdrawn and sent to Italy. Manstein protested vigorously. He argued that he was on the verge of breakthrough, that one more push would do it. But Hitler was adamant. The offensive was over. In reality, Manstein was wrong. Soviet reserves behind Prokhorovka were enormous. Even if he had broken through, he would have faced another 1,500 tanks and 5 fresh armies. The Soviets had prepared for this eventuality. With the German offensive broken, the Soviets launched their own massive counter-offensives. Operation Kutuzov targeted the Orel salient to the north. Operation Rumyantsev struck toward Kharkov in the south. These weren't limited counterattacks. These were massive offensives involving over 2 million men. The Germans, exhausted and depleted from Citadel, fell back. Units that had been the hammer at Kursk were now the anvil, desperately defending. The Soviets were no longer the same army of 1941. They had learned combined arms warfare. Their tactics improved. Their commanders were experienced. Soviet artillery pulverized German defensive positions. The Soviets had mastered the art of the artillery preparation. Hour after hour of sustained bombardment that shattered defences and broke German morale. Then came the tanks and infantry, rolling over stunned survivors. By August 5th, the Soviets had liberated Orel. By August 23rd, they recaptured Kharkov, the city that had changed hands 4 times during the war. The entire German southern wing was in retreat. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had permanently passed to the Soviet Union. The Battle of Kursk and the subsequent counter-offensives cost both sides catastrophically. Soviet losses were enormous, over 800,000 casualties, including 250,000 dead. They lost over 6,000 tanks and 1,600 aircraft. But the Germans could not afford their losses. They suffered perhaps 200,000 casualties and lost over 1,500 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. More critically, they lost veteran soldiers and irreplaceable equipment. Germany's armoured forces never recovered. The panzer divisions that had been the backbone of German offensive power were shadows of themselves. The strategic consequences were even more profound. Kursk was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, Germany would be on the defensive, reacting to Soviet moves rather than making its own. For the Soviet Union, Kursk was a turning point. They had faced Germany's best shot and not just survived but triumphed. The Red Army had proven it could defeat the Wehrmacht in offensive operations, not just desperate defences. Morale soared. The long road to Berlin had begun. The psychological impact was equally important. German soldiers who had marched into Russia in 1941 believing in inevitable victory now fought with the knowledge that defeat was possible, even likely. Soviet soldiers who had retreated in panic in 1941 now advanced with confidence. Kursk was a laboratory of armoured warfare. The Germans had technological superiority. The Tiger and Panther were better individual tanks than anything the Soviets fielded. But the Soviets had learned that numbers, properly employed, could overcome quality. The T-34, though outgunned by German heavy tanks, proved that a design that emphasized mobility, reliability, and ease of production could be strategically superior to technically advanced but complicated designs. The Soviets could lose 3 T-34s for every Panther destroyed and still come out ahead. They built 3 times as many tanks. The Germans learned bitter lessons about logistics. Their advanced tanks broke down frequently. The Panther rushed into combat before its teething problems were solved, had a mechanical reliability rate of barely 50%. Tigers required extensive maintenance. When tanks broke down far from repair facilities, they had to be abandoned. The battle validated the concept of defense in depth. The Soviets proved that with sufficient preparation, even a powerful offensive could be stopped. Their 8 defensive belts, while costly in manpower and materiel to build, proved their worth. Even when the Germans penetrated several belts, there were always more behind them. Today, on the fields around Kursk and Prokhorovka, memorials stand where the great battles were fought. The largest is a 50-metre-tall bell tower at Prokhorovka, visible for kilometres across the steppe. In the surrounding fields, farmers still occasionally unearth unexploded shells, tank parts, and human remains. The Battle of Kursk was the decisive battle on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the question was no longer whether Germany would lose the war in the East, but when. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight skillfully and bravely, but they were fighting a defensive war of attrition they could not win. From Kursk, the Red Army would advance relentlessly westward. Kiev would fall in November 1943. By summer 1944, Operation Bagration would destroy Army Group Center. By January 1945, Soviet forces would be on German soil. The road from Kursk led to Berlin. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. Over 1 million casualties on both sides in 50 days. Thousands of tanks destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians displaced. Entire villages wiped from the map. The earth itself was poisoned by oil, explosives, and blood. For decades after, Soviet veterans would return to Kursk for commemorations. German veterans too, though their memories were more complicated, pride in how they fought, horror at what they fought for. By the 21st century, these veterans are nearly all gone, but their sacrifice and suffering should not be forgotten. The Battle of Kursk reminds us of several truths. That technological superiority alone cannot guarantee victory. That defensive preparation and intelligence can overcome even the most powerful offensive. That human courage on both sides can be found even in the most terrible circumstances. And that war, even when necessary, exacts a price almost too terrible to contemplate. The fields around Kursk are quiet now. Wheat grows where tanks once battled. Children play where men once died. But the echoes of that summer of 1943 still resonate through history. The summer when the greatest tank battle ever fought determined the fate of the Second World War.